Let's unpack this. We are diving into a story of, well, profound institutional failure and succession, theological reckoning, all set over 3 millennia ago. But it's a story that still forces us to confront these fundamental questions about unchecked power, the corrosive effects, and really the absolute necessity of integrity in leadership.
Absolutely.
We're setting the stage in the ancient Iron Age sanctuary of Shiloh, diving deep into 1 Samuel chapters 2 through 4. It's the dramatic narrative of High Priest Eli's, well, fatally corrupt house, and the surprising quiet rise of the prophet Samuel.
And our mission today, as you requested, is really comprehensive. We want to provide the deepest possible context. We understand you want to go beyond just, summarizing the plot.
Exactly.
When we say deep context, we mean we need to contextualize every key person and every perspective. That means understanding the biblical characters, Eli, Hophni, Phinehas, Samuel, in their original Iron Age setting. And then tracing the centuries of thought that followed. We need to look at the ancient textual critics, the Talmudic sages, the medieval philosophers, and even modern theologians who spent centuries wrestling with what this, frankly, scandalous text actually means for faith and governance.
Exactly. This story is essentially about a seismic transfer of legitimate authority. It moves so dramatically from a failing hereditary priesthood, which was geographically, physically fixed at this cult center,
At Shiloh.
to a charismatic, listening, prophetic voice. The system, as it existed, just breaks down, and the divine has to find an entirely new channel. This shift is really the initial crisis we need to examine. So let's start with the physical context, Shiloh. It might sound like just another place name, but the sources seem to confirm its massive significance, which makes the corruption there even more severe, doesn't it?
That's absolutely right. The historical context here is crucial. Archaeological work at Tel Shiloh, or Khirbet Silon as it's known today, confirms this site was a significant Iron Fantasy Highland cultic center. The context the narrative describes, late 2nd millennium, moving into the early 1st millennium BCE, it fits perfectly with the site's known occupation history. There's evidence of intense cultic activity.
So it wasn't just like a temporary setup?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a campsite. This was a major governmental and spiritual nexus for the Highland tribes at that time.
And what was its exact function in this period? It seems like a transition time.
It was. It functioned as a semi-permanent sanctuary where the Ark of the Covenant resided. This places the narrative right in a critical transition period for the cult of Israel.
How so?
Well, they were moving away from the highly mobile tabernacle model, the one associated with the wilderness wanderings, and a very itinerant faith.
Right, the tent.
Exactly. They were moving towards a fixed precinct. This step was structurally preparing the way, in a sense, for the later permanent temple in Jerusalem.
Okay.
So, when the place where the Ark resides, the fixed center of the faith, you could almost say the spiritual capital, is compromised by corruption. Well, the crisis isn't just local, it's existential for the entire nation.
Okay, now let's introduce the man at the top, the one whose failure kind of kicks off this disaster, High Priest Eli. We need to zero in on his specific context and, I guess, the fatal fracture in his character that the text really spotlights.
Right. Eli was the elderly high priest of Israel at Shiloh. That means he was the ultimate spiritual authority. But the text also tells us he served as a judge.
So, head of both church and state, effectively.
In a way, yes. His role placed him at the apex of both the legal and the cultic structures of early Israel. Yet his legacy is defined by his failure of leadership, and the text judges this failure harshly, primarily as an act of omission.
We do see him rebuke his sons verbally in chapter 2, though. Why wasn't that enough? That always feels a bit harsh.
That's the key theological nuance, isn't it? His sin was fundamentally a failure of omission, not commission. The divine judgment goes past his verbal reprimands, which, yes, we see in 2.23-2b5.
Okay.
But the actual indictment, the reason for the condemnation of his whole house, is that he failed to actively restrain them, or critically remove them from their sacred office. That's spelled out in 3.13. And the text delivers this crushing theological statement in 2.29. Eli was condemned for honoring his sons more than God.
Wow.
This prioritizing of familial affection, this nepotism essentially over divine honor and institutional integrity, that's the core flaw. It leads to the utter destruction of his entire house's authority. He protected the hereditary line, his family, at the expense of his public duty.
Okay, so let's move to the active agents of corruption then. His two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. What were their specific roles and how did their abuse actually manifest?
They were priests, serving under their father Eli at Shiloh. And their corruption was, well, twofold. It encompassed both priestly economics, abusing the sacrificial system, and a pretty shocking level of personal immorality. They fundamentally violated their fiduciary and sacred trust.
Let's talk about the economic abuse first, because the sources seem to frame this as both a legal trespass and a theological betrayal.
Absolutely. It was both. You have to remember, priests relied on specific portions of the sacrifices for their livelihood. It was a complex system of religious economics. Hophni and Phinehas corrupted this system by taking their share improperly. Specifically, before the fat, which was considered God's portion, was properly offered up on the altar. That's detailed in 2.1317 and referenced again in 2.29.
How exactly did they do that? The text mentions a fork.
Yes, the text describes their practice vividly. They'd send a servant with this large three-pronged fork to just stab into the cauldron where the meat was boiling.
Oh, wow.
And take whatever came up. This wasn't just, administrative mismanagement or skimming a bit off the top. This was predatory behavior. By preempting the offering, by taking their cut before the sacred act was complete, they undermined the integrity of the worshiper's relationship with the divine. They turned a sacred act into this, grotesque transaction for their own personal gain. The text even says they taught the people to despise the offering of the Lord.
That's serious. And then there's the other part, the sexual misconduct, the defilement of the sacred space itself.
Yes, the source material is explicit about that too. It states they were engaged in sexual misconduct with the women who were serving at the sanctuary's entrance, mentioned in 2.22.
So, right there at the holy site.
Right there. The combination of exploiting the economic vulnerability of the worshipers and defiling the sacred space through gross immorality. It constituted an existential threat to the whole system. It meant the very spiritual heart of the nation was poisoned from within.
And the consequence?
The verdict was absolute. They were eventually killed by the Philistines in battle, fulfilling the prophecy of divine judgment against Eli's house. No escaping it.
Okay, so in stark contrast to this spectacularly failing hereditary line, the narrative introduces our rising authority figure, Samuel. This is where the shift really begins, isn't it?
It is. Samuel is introduced as a prophet, famously the child of Hannah, who dedicated him to God's service under Eli right from childhood. His function in the narrative is pivotal.
Why pivotal?
Because he is the innocent recipient of the divine revelation that condemns Eli's house. He's just a boy, but crucially, he is listening when apparently no one else is, certainly not the established priesthood. This symbolizes the clean transfer of legitimate authority. It moves away from the corrupt, inherited cultic power represented by Eli and his sons, and towards this charismatic prophetic figure, Samuel. He derives his authority not from lineage, not from birthright, but from his availability and his willingness to hear and speak the divine word. Now, to truly grasp the significance of this whole narrative, we need to understand the historical framework behind the text itself. We need to apply that historical critical lens and talk about the editors, specifically the Deuteronomistic history, or DTRH.
Okay, let's define that for the listener. If we're reading the story of Eli and Samuel in 1 Samuel, why is this DTRH context so critical? What does it add?
Well, think of the Deuteronomistic historians as sort of the constitutional lawyers, or maybe the theological historians of ancient Israelite history. Scholarly consensus places the core Samuel narratives, the original stories, probably in the early monarchy period.
Okay.
But the text we have, the book of Samuel as it exists, was heavily edited and structured much later, probably by scribal circles during the Babylonian exile or the early post-exilic period. We're talking roughly 6th to 5th centuries BCE.
So a time of national crisis.
Exactly, a time of immense national trauma. The temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed, the kingship was lost, the elite were exiled, and the people were asking fundamentally, why? Why did this happen to us?
So the DTRH editors used this old Shiloh story, this scandal from centuries earlier, to help answer that why. What was their central purpose in highlighting this specific, scandalous example of corruption?
They used this pericope, this literary unit about Shiloh, to articulate core theological concerns they believed were necessary for national survival and restoration. Things like the absolute need for cultic fidelity, the vital importance of ethical leadership, and crucially, the predictable, disastrous consequences of moral failure right at the top.
So it's a cautionary tale.
Very much so. By juxtaposing the failing Shiloh priesthood with Samuel's pure rise, the text effectively justifies the end of that old cultic system at Shiloh. And very importantly, it prepares the ground theologically for the new system of authority they saw as necessary. The monarchy. It's like a theological autopsy justifying radical change.
The narrative structure itself, the way the story is told, seems incredibly deliberate. The sources point out this triad of tensions that seem encoded in the DTRH framing.
Oh, definitely. They engineered the narrative tension perfectly to make their point. First, you have the glaring tension between priestly corruption versus prophetic purity. That's chapters 2.1-17, the son's behavior, contrasted sharply with chapter 3.121, Samuel's call. The supposed stewards of the sacred are shown to be the most defiled.
Okay, what's the second?
Second, there's divine silence versus revelation. Chapter 3, verse 1 explicitly notes the word of the Lord was scarce in those days. Visions were infrequent. This contrasts powerfully with Samuel's clear, direct call from God just verses later in 3.4:14. God is silent to the privileged, corrupt establishment, but speaks clearly to the available listening child.
Right. And the third tension seems the most critical for explaining this big shift in governance that the story narrates.
I think it is. It's the most foundational one for the whole DTRH project. Hereditary privilege versus charismatic merit. Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, they have the title, the lineage, the inherited office. But Samuel, the dedicated, vowed child, he had the character and critically the ear of God.
So merit over birthright.
Exactly. The editors are essentially shouting from the rooftops that birthright is meaningless, even dangerous, without ethical conduct. And the literary craft here is brilliant, the way the text alternates between Samuel panels, showing him growing in favor with God and people, and Eli house panels, showing the corrupt elders sinking deeper into disgrace. It just heightens the irony and drives the point home.
This brings us back to Eli's own culpability, which, as I said, always feels perhaps disproportionately harsh. The text is so clear he's being punished for his omission, for not stopping his sons. Why is this sin deemed unatonable by ritual sacrifice? That seems extreme.
It is extreme, and that's the point. This is a devastating theological verdict within the context of ancient Israelite religion. We have to remember that in the ancient world, most sins, even quite severe ones, could theoretically be atoned for through the prescribed rituals, sacrifice, offerings, restitution, purification rites.
Right, that was the system.
That was the system. But when the prophet delivers the divine sentence to Eli about his house, in chapter 3, verse 14, the sin is explicitly deemed unatonable by those very means. It states the guilt of Eli's house will not be purged by sacrifice or offering forever.
So why the absolute finality? What makes this different?
Because the sin itself corrupted the very mechanism of atonement. Eli's sons had made a mockery of the sacrifice and the offerings. They turned the system designed to repair covenant breaches, to bring people back into right relationship with God, into a tool for their own predatory enrichment and abuse.
Ah, I see.
When the system itself is broken and predatory at its core, no amount of performing the rituals within that broken system can fix it. The DTRH editors use this passage powerfully to stress that institutional ethical failure, especially at the sanctuary itself, goes beyond the power of ritual repair. When the ethical foundation is shattered, a total, irreversible break is required. It's a stark lesson that ethics must precede and undergird ritual. Ritual can't whitewash fundamental injustice.
And what's truly fascinating and kind of drives home this point about systemic failure is that the narrative structure doesn't allow you, the listener, to just write this off as a one-off failure specific to Eli's messed up family. The text actually proves the corruption is systemic by repeating the failure with Samuel's own sons later on. Let's introduce Joel and Abijah.
Right, this is a crucial turn later in 1 Samuel. Joel and Abijah are Samuel's two sons. Now, Samuel, the charismatic prophet, represented this new model of pure, merit-based authority, stepping in where the hereditary priests failed. But when Samuel himself gets old and tries to create a hereditary system by appointing his own sons as judges to succeed him, they tragically repeat the exact same pattern of collapse.
How so? What did they do?
The text explicitly tells us in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 3, that they turned corrupt. They didn't follow their father's ways. Instead, they turned aside after gain accepted bribes and perverted justice.
So the type of corruption changed slightly from the cultic and sexual abuse under Eli's sons to judicial and economic abuse under Samuel's sons, but the systemic failure of inherited authority remained exactly the same. Is that the point?
Precisely. Eli's sons committed abuse within the sacred space, defiling the cult. Samuel's sons committed abuse within the civic space, perverting social justice and the legal system. The recurrence is powerful. It demonstrates that the problem isn't just Eli or just Hophni and Phinehas. The problem is the systemic risk inherent in passing down authority based solely on birthright, on lineage alone, without regard for character or competence.
And this leads directly to
This repeated failure by hereditary leaders, first priests, then judges, provides the final ethical justification within the narrative for the people's subsequent request for a king in 1 Samuel 8, verse 5. They basically say, your sons don't walk in your ways. Appoint us a king to judge us like all the other nations. The narrative demands a new structure, a monarchic model, because the old systems of inherited power, both cultic and judicial, keep breaking down due to corruption. The DTRH editors thus use this entire arc, from Eli to Samuel's sons, to theologically justify the transition to the age of kingship.
Okay, now we get to the core of your request for this deep dive. Tracking the context of the commentary tradition itself. This text about institutional failure at Shiloh is obviously foundational, maybe even foundational trauma. But how did generations of Jewish scholars, the sages, the rabbis, the philosophers, grapple with such a raw, frankly scandalous text about the leaders, the founders of their faith? We need to provide context for who these interpreters were and how they actually read this difficult material.
Yes, this interpretive journey is absolutely crucial, and it demonstrates immense intellectual sophistication over centuries. It was often driven by, well, a complex set of needs. On one hand, there was a need for legal agadic harmonization, trying to make the law work smoothly with the narrative tradition. On the other hand, there was often a palpable need to protect communal honor, the reputation of Israel's leaders,
Right.
while simultaneously stressing absolute accountability for wrongdoing. It's a delicate balancing act. Relatively antique voices, Amoraic and Targumic.
Let's start way back in the late antique period with the Talmudic sages. Who were these scholars exactly, and what was their primary priority when reading a challenging text like this one?
Okay, so these were the influential Jewish scholars and jurists known as the Amorim. They were operating primarily between about 200 and 500 CE, but the key figures discussing this passage, like Rav, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yohanan, Resh Lakish, were prominent in the 3rd century CE, 200-300.
What was their world like?
They were working in the post-temple world after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. Their huge task was establishing a robust, portable system of Jewish law and identities centered on Torah study and observance, now without the temple cult. So their primary concern was often maintaining reverence for the past, ensuring continuity and promoting communal stability. Rabbi Yohanan, for instance, is known to have often resisted readings that unnecessarily scandalized Israel's foundational leaders.
Okay, so that context leads directly to their most famous, some might say infamous, interpretive maneuver regarding Eli's sons. It almost seems like damage control.
It certainly looks that way from a modern perspective. It's found in the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Shabbat, page 55b. The sages there famously suggest, and this is a bit of a shock statement, whoever says the sons of Eli sinned in the way the plain text suggests is mistaken.
Whoa, how did they justify that? The text seems pretty clear.
Well, they didn't deny wrongdoing entirely. Instead, they recast the sons' corruption. They shifted it away from literal, explicit sexual misconduct with the women at the sanctuary entrance. Instead, they interpreted the offense primarily as procedural abuse.
Procedural abuse? How?
They argued the sons were guilty of causing undue delay and hardship for women who came to bring certain offerings, specifically peace offerings, which involved a meal. The priests, they argued, improperly insisted on the full completion of complex sacrificial rites first, forcing the women to wait, sometimes even overnight, before they could complete their rituals and return home. This, the sages argued, was an abuse of power, a lack of consideration, perhaps even cruelty. But they stopped short of accusing them of outright sexual immorality, as 2.22 seems to imply.
Wait a minute, isn't that just a form of institutional cover-up? How could they ethically justify essentially ignoring the plain meaning of the text a shot to protect communal honor? That seems problematic.
That's a brilliant and necessary question. And it highlights the perennial tension in rabbinic interpretation between peshat, the plain literal meaning, and darash, the homiletical, legal, or interpretive meaning derived for specific purposes. For the sages, in this context, the purpose was largely pedagogical and maybe even sociological.
Explain that.
If the foundational priests at Shiloh, the predecessors of the entire temple priesthood, were guilty of gross sexual immorality at the sanctuary itself, it could risk delegitimizing the entire priestly system they were trying to preserve and understand in a post-temple era. By limiting the sin to procedural abuse, serious abuses of power, yes, but not sexual defilement, they could still hold the priests accountable for wrongdoing while preserving the essential holiness or integrity of Israel's foundational leadership lineage itself. It was a highly sophisticated, maybe uncomfortable trade-off, softening the most scandalous detail to preserve the moral authority necessary for the community's identity and continuity.
But they didn't let Eli off the hook for his failure of oversight, right? Did they soften his judgment too?
Absolutely not. They fully maintained the severity of the divine judgment against Eli's house. In another key Talmudic passage, this one in Rosh Hashanah 18a, They affirmed the biblical decree that the sin of Eli's house could not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering.
Okay.
But they added a crucial rabbinic insight. While sacrifice wouldn't work, atonement could still be achieved through intense devotion to Torah study and the practice of asad acts of loving kindness and communal support.
Ah, so ethical action, not just ritual.
Exactly. This aligns perfectly in a way with the original Deuteronomistic critique. Institutional ethical failure requires profound ethical and spiritual repair, acts of justice and learning, not just going through the motions of ritual cleanup.
We also need to quickly mention the Targum Jonathan, the interpretive Aramaic translation from roughly the same period. What did it add?
Right, Jonathan ben Uzziel is traditionally credited with the Targum Jonathan, the Aramaic translation and paraphrase of the prophets, likely compiled between the 1st and 3rd century CE. This was incredibly important because Aramaic had become the common vernacular language for many Jews.
And how did it handle this story?
The Targumic method often involved clarifying legal nuances or intensifying the theological drama to make the teaching clearer for synagogue audiences. For example, regarding 1 Samuel 3.1, where the Hebrew says the word of the Lord was scarce, Hebrew Yakor, the Targum Jonathan paraphrases it as the word of the Lord was hidden or concealed, Aramaic mitkasi.
Why is that difference significant?
By stressing active concealment rather than mere rarity, it makes Samuel's subsequent call, the clear, direct, personal revelation that breaks through this concealment, an even more powerful and dramatic moment of prophetic breakthrough. It heightens the sense that God had withdrawn, but now actively chooses to reveal himself again through Samuel. Hashtag be medieval peshat and philosophical rigor.
Okay, let's move forward significantly in time into the medieval period. Here we see a real rise in focus on linguistic precision and philosophical structure. The emphasis often shifts towards Peshat, trying to understand the plain contextual meaning of the text. And we absolutely have to start with Rashi, probably the most towering figure in all of Jewish commentary.
Without a doubt. Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki, known universally as Rashi, 1040-1105, was the definitive French rabbi. His commentaries on both the Tanakh, Hebrew Bible, and the Talmud became foundational and essentially defined Jewish study for a millennium.
What was his context? What shaped his approach?
He lived in Troyes, France, during a period of significant growth for the Franco-German Ashkenazi Jewish community. His genius lay in his remarkable lucidity, his ability to explain complex texts concisely and clearly. He masterfully integrated classic midrash, the earlier interpretive tradition we just discussed, right into his explanations of the Peshat, making the dense tapestry of Jewish thought accessible to students. Accessibility and anchoring interpretation and tradition were key for him.
So faced with the Eli-Samuel contrast, what did Rashi pull out? How did he use his method here?
Rashi was excellent at spotting and highlighting the literary polarity, the deliberate contrast built into the text by the original author or editor. For example, in his comment on 1 Samuel 2.18, Rashi specifically spotlights Samuel's simple linen ephod, just a basic priestly garment worn by the boy Samuel while serving in the sanctuary.
Okay.
Rashi presents this simple garment as an emblem of Samuel's pure, dedicated, selfless service. He implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, contrasts the small detail, the textile of service, directly with these extravagant, predatory, self-serving behavior of Eli's sons described just verses earlier. For Rashi, the text itself provides the ethical standard through these contrasts, and he highlights how Samuel's pure service is the perfect foil to the son's abuse.
Now, Rashi's contemporary, Maharikara, apparently took an even stricter approach, focusing perhaps more purely on the contextual meaning. Tell us about Rabbi Yosef Kara.
Right, Maharikara, Rabbi Yosef Kara, circa 1065-1135, was also from Troyes, likely a student or colleague associated with Rashi's school. However, he became known for pursuing a more stringent, contextual syntactic Peshat. He often deliberately pushed back against Rashi's frequent integration of midrashic explanations, seeking instead the meaning derived purely from the grammar, syntax, and immediate context of the verse.
So, less tradition, more direct textual analysis.
In a way, yes. His critical insight regarding the Shiloh narrative focused particularly on the literary structure. Maharikara stressed that the very alternation of scenes showing Samuel growing in stature while the sons descend into failure is not accidental. He argued it's a deliberate rhetorical device, consciously crafted by the author.
What was the purpose of this device, according to him?
To teach a core lesson. Leadership legitimacy is entirely contingent on ethical behavior and, crucially, on restraint. The structure itself is the commentary. By juxtaposing the scenes, the text demonstrates, without needing extra interpretation, that authority isn't guaranteed by birth. It's earned and maintained through conduct.
Let's move south now to the incredibly influential Spanish polymath Ibn Ezra. Can you give us the context for Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra? He seems like a very different kind of thinker.
Very different, yes. Ibn Ezra, 1089–1167, was a giant of the Spanish Golden Age, a poet, philosopher, grammarian, astronomer, physician, and biblical commentator. He brought a highly scientific, linguistic, and often rationalist rigor to the text. He was deeply concerned with the precise meaning of words, grammatical structures, and sometimes the specific conditions and even naturalistic mechanisms behind divine action or revelation.
How did that rationalist bent apply to Samuel's call?
Well, he focused intently on the specific details of the scene where Samuel is called by God during the night. He stressed the importance of the temporal marker in 1 Samuel 3.3, the detail that the scene takes place just before the lamp of God went out, usually interpreted as just before dawn.
Why did he find that timing significant?
For Ibn Ezra, this wasn't just scene-setting color. He saw it as marking a liminal time, that quiet transitional period between the deepest darkness and the first light of dawn. He believed, based on his understanding of psychology and physiology perhaps, that this specific state, this liminal consciousness, was particularly suitable for receiving authentic prophecy, true visions. It aligns with his broader rationalist interest in trying to define the conditions, maybe even the natural laws, governing spiritual phenomena like prophecy.
Fascinating. And then, arguably the most famous Jewish philosopher of all time, Rambam, or Maimonides, how did he structure Samuel's dramatic call within his massive philosophical framework?
Rambam, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, 1138–1204, was the preeminent Jewish philosopher and jurist of the Middle Ages, born in Cordoba, Spain, but living much of his life in Egypt. His entire philosophical system, especially in his Guide for the Perplexed, aimed to harmonize revelation with reason. He viewed prophecy not as an arbitrary miracle, but as a culmination of intellectual and moral perfection, a graded state one could potentially achieve.
So how did Samuel's experience fit into that ordered system?
Rambam required philosophical consistency. His key insight regarding Samuel's first oracle was that it must conform to the established rules governing authentic prophecy. And for Rambam, a core rule was this: authentic prophecy always functions to fortify law, justice, and morality. It never serves to support or enable institutional abuse or injustice. Samuel receiving the word condemning Eli's corrupt house perfectly fits this model prophecy arises to correct injustice.
And what about the unatonable decree? Did that fit Rambam's system too?
Perfectly. The declaration in 3.14 that the sin wouldn't be atoned by sacrifice aligns precisely with Rambam's well-defined hierarchy of sins and merits. Rambam consistently taught that ethical failures, especially those involving public trust or the foundations of justice, are far more severe and harder to repair than purely ritual transgressions. For Rambam, ethics always outrank ritual in the public sphere. The verdict on Eli's house confirms this principle.
And finally, in this section of medieval Peshat commentators, let's touch on Radak the grammarian. Who was Rabbi David Kamei?
Radak, Rabbi David Kamei, circa 1160–1235, was a key figure from Provence in southern France. He was primarily a grammarian and lexicographer, known for his clear, concise commentary that heavily emphasized precise grammatical analysis and the plain meaning, Peshat, of the text.
What was his particular focus or context?
Radak lived and wrote in an environment often marked by intense interfaith polemics, particularly with Christianity. This context perhaps increased the importance of establishing the clear, defensible, grammatically sound meaning of the Hebrew text. His commentary became hugely popular for its clarity and linguistic precision.
How did he approach the Shiloh narrative?
He heavily emphasized the linguistic details to make theological points. For instance, he stressed the phrase, "the word of the Lord was rare," 3.1, to underscore the unique status of Samuel as a true prophet emerging in a time of spiritual darkness. He also focused on the specific language describing Eli's failure to rebuke his sons effectively, as highlighted in 3.13 in some interpretations, to show that Eli's error wasn't vague negligence, but a definite, specific failure of action, or rather, inaction.
And his overall verdict.
Radak's reading, grounded in the text's grammar, led to a purely merit-based conclusion, very much in line with Maharikara and others. Lineage, birthright, does not sustain leadership. Only ethical merit and divine selection do. The grammar and the narrative lead to the same place. ###Z, later medieval and early modern political readings. As we move into the later medieval and early modern periods, particularly after major upheavals like the Crusades and especially the expulsion from Spain, you often see commentators reading this text through a much sharper political lens. The institutional failure at Shiloh starts to resonate with their own experiences of political instability and national trauma.
Let's start with Ramban, Namades. He seems to bridge the gap, combining the plain meaning with a more mystical or symbolic approach.
That's a good way to put it. Rabbi Moses ben Nathan, known as Ramban or Nachmanides, 1194 to 1270, was a leading Spanish halachist, legal expert, and physician, but also a prominent Kabbalist or mystic. His commentary is famous for combining a serious engagement with Peshat, often debating Ibn Ezra, with explorations of Sod, the deeper symbolic or mystical meanings of the text.
How did he view the Shiloh story through that combined lens?
Ramban viewed the physical events, the loss of the ark to the Philistines, the subsequent destruction of the sanctuary at Shiloh, not just as historical occurrences, but as external manifestations of a deeper spiritual reality. He saw the removal of Shiloh's efficacy as prefiguring or symbolizing the potential withdrawal of the divine presence, the Shekinah, from any desecrated space, including potentially the later temple in Jerusalem if it too became corrupt.
So, a warning about consequences.
Yes, and specifically linked to divine justice. For Rahman, this narrative was a prime example of God operating according to the strict justice principle of midikineg, meaning measure for measure. Because the sanctuary leadership had defiled the sacred space through their actions, the consequence, measure for measure, was that the divine presence had to depart, and the sanctuary lost its holiness and protection. The external destruction mirrored the internal corruption.
And then, perhaps reading this with even more raw political urgency, we have Don Isaac Abarbanel writing amid the absolute trauma of the expulsion from Spain.
Yes, Abarbanel, 1437-1508, provides a stark and fascinating perspective. He wasn't just a scholar. He was an Iberian statesman, a financier, a former treasurer, and trusted advisor to the royal courts of Portugal and then Spain, right up until the devastating expulsion of the Jews in 1492 forced him into exile in Italy.
That experience must have profoundly shaped his reading.
Profoundly. He approached the Bible using a distinctive question-driven historical political methodology. He constantly asked questions about the motivations of the characters, the political context, the lessons in statecraft. His commentary on Samuel, written in exile, is deeply informed by his life as a high-ranking political insider who then became a refugee, witnessing the collapse of a world.
So how did that context shape his reading of Eli's downfall specifically?
He framed Eli's downfall not merely as a religious or moral failure, but as a critical, almost textbook warning on statecraft and the dynamics of regime change. Abarbanel, having served monarchs, asked pointed questions. If the people are suffering under corrupt leadership, even divinely appointed leadership like the priesthood, is it God's will simply to maintain that corrupt regime indefinitely?
And his answer?
His answer, drawn from this text, was a resounding no. When cult officials, or by extension any state officials, prey on the citizens they are meant to serve, when they undermine the social contract through greed and abuse, God himself can and will authorize new leadership channels. In this case, it was the prophet Samuel emerging outside the established priestly line. For Abarbanel, the pivot from the corrupt Shiloh priest to the righteous Samuel was a profound lesson in divinely authorized revolution, or at least radical reform, reflecting the political instability and the failures of leadership he'd witnessed firsthand. It's a very political reading. #D, modern ethical and phenomenological readings. And this powerful narrative continues to resonate. Even as we move into the modern era, it remains a potent lens for discussing the ethics of public service, the nature of divine revelation, and the responsibility that comes with power.
Let's look first at Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch in 19th century Germany and his focus on public trust.
Right. Rabbi Hirsch, 1808-1888, was the influential leader of the Orthodox community in Frankfurt am Main. He famously articulated the philosophy of Torah im derech eretz, which sought to synthesize traditional Torah observance with engagement with modern culture, the way of the world. His project was about building a confident, modern, observant orthodoxy.
How did the Eli narrative fit into that project?
For Hirsch, the Shiloh story was less about ancient history or predicting future events, and more about timeless ethical principles applicable to modern life, particularly the ethics of holding positions of public responsibility. He treated the priesthood described in the text not primarily as a hereditary privilege or a mystical status, but fundamentally as a public trust.
So like a civic duty.
Exactly. His reading focused intensely on the integrity required for any form of sanctified service, whether religious or secular. He turned this chapter into a powerful civics lesson, stressing that holding an office, any office, is meaningless or even harmful without the underlying integrity and commitment to serve those entrusted to your care. It's integrity over office, always.
And finally, let's consider one of the most powerful 20th century theological readings, which comes from Abraham Joshua Heschel. How did this ancient narrative fit into his very modern concept of divine pathos?
Heschel, 1907-1972, the great Polish-American theologian and philosopher, is renowned for his focus on divine pathos, his idea that God is not remote and impassive, but deeply involved, feeling, and responsive to human actions, particularly to injustice and suffering.
So God feels things.
Yes, God cares profoundly. For Heschel, the Shiloh narrative is a perfect, paradigmatic example of God breaking divine silence precisely because of injustice. God isn't just enforcing abstract rules. God hears the cries of the abused worshiper, the person whose sincere offering was mocked, stolen, and exploited by the very institutional leaders meant to facilitate their connection with the divine.
And Samuel's role in that.
Samuel becomes the human voice for this divine pathos. He becomes the instrument for the God who feels the wrong being done and demands that it be made right. Prophetic action, in Heschel's reading, becomes an ethical necessity arising directly from God's empathetic response to suffering, specifically to restore justice within the sacred space itself. It's a powerful defense of the vulnerable individual against the abusive power of the institution.
Wow, what an incredible trajectory of interpretation we've traced. From the, let's say, procedural protectionism sought by the Talmudic sages back in 300 CE, all the way to the profound call for ethical integrity and divine empathy demanded by Heschel in the 20th century. This text clearly remains a living commentary on the persistent, difficult problem of corrupt authority.
Now, to fully appreciate the context, especially given the centuries of interpretation, we should also briefly step back and recognize that we're reading this text not as a single perfectly fixed original, but as part of a living textual tradition. Looking quickly at the textual landscape, the manuscript variations can sometimes give us a slightly fuller picture of how Samuel's emerging authority was understood early on.
Okay, so we're talking about differences between, say, the Masoretic text, MT, which is the standard Hebrew text we usually use, versus older versions like the Old Greek Septuagint LXX translation or the Samuel scrolls found at Qumran. What's notable in this particular narrative?
There are a couple of small moments worth noting, less for changing the core story and more for showing how early scribes and translators grappled with the details. First is that little question of proximity in 1 Samuel 3.3. The MT says Samuel was lying down in the temple, Hekal of the Lord, where the Ark of God was.
Right, which sounds very close, maybe too close.
Exactly. This phrase raised questions for later readers, and maybe even early ones. Should a young boy, not even a full priest yet, be sleeping right next to the Ark of the Covenant, the holiest object in Israel? Some ancient translators, perhaps uncomfortable with this intimacy, seem to smooth this nuance slightly in their renderings, implying he was merely near the sacred space, perhaps in an adjacent chamber within the sanctuary complex. But they all retain the essential nocturnal setting of this profound divine encounter. The core event isn't changed.
Okay. And the second technical variant you mentioned, it relates more directly to Samuel's growing credibility.
Yes, this one is at the transition point in 1 Samuel 4.1a, which effectively closes the narrative of Samuel's call and establishes his authority. The standard Hebrew text, the MT, reads straightforwardly, "And the word of Samuel came to all Israel." This confirms his national credibility. His message is now for everyone.
But other versions read differently.
Slightly. The Old Greek, LXX, and some readings related to the Qumran Samuel scroll, 4Q Sams, sometimes present variant transitional phrasing here, connecting Samuel's word more directly to the subsequent battle narrative against the Philistines. While the specific wording differs across these manuscript traditions, the theological upshot remains remarkably consistent in all versions. Samuel's prophetic credibility is expanding nationwide precisely as the hereditary priestly legitimacy of Eli's house is contracting and about to face its final judgment. These technical variations, if anything, confirm the core moral trajectory of the story, rather than undermining it.
Got it. Now let's shift from textual variants to the power of specific Hebrew words within the main text itself. Because the original diction, the word choices, seem critical for driving the ethical contrasts we've been discussing all along.
Absolutely. The Hebrew really anchors the entire ethical architecture of this story. Consider, for instance, the profound contrast between the attitude of availability and predation. The narrative hinges on Samuel's repeated, instinctive, triple use of the word hineni. Here I am, when he hears the call in the night, in 3.4, 6, and 8.
What does hineni really signify?
Hineni denotes immediate presence, absolute availability, readiness to serve, and profound humility. It's the quintessential response of the servant ready for a divine command. This attitude of radical availability is placed in direct, jarring opposition to the predatory, fork first, taking behavior of Eli's sons, who were only concerned with getting their portion.
So it's a contrast between being utterly available for divine service and being completely unavailable because you're focused entirely on self-enrichment and entitlement.
That's the fundamental ethical framework being established. But the narrative sharpens the point even further. The key command that Samuel eventually receives from God through Eli's instruction is to respond with, Deba Adonai ki shomea abdeka. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening, 3.9 to 10.
Shomea, listening or hearing.
Yes. This word declares an ethic of receptivity that fundamentally contrasts with Eli's sons, who clearly ignored God's voice, ignored the people's complaints, and even ignored the direct warnings of their own father. Samuel shifts from merely being physically present, Hineni, to being ethically, spiritually receptive, Shomea. The true prophet isn't just someone physically located in the temple. They're someone mentally and morally attuned to hear and obey the divine voice.
And finally, let's revisit that recurring word for sacrifice, the one that becomes central to the judgment. Zeva.
Right. Zeva sacrifice and mina offering reappear crucially in the verdict itself in 3.14. Therefore, I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice, ziva, or offering minda forever. The literary craft confirms the theological point made earlier. You cannot use the ritual mechanism, devamina, to clean up an ethical failure that fundamentally undermines the very meaning and integrity of the ritual itself. Ritual must be an authentic expression of faith and ethics. It cannot function as a substitute for them, especially when the ethics themselves have been violated through the ritual.
Okay.
I think the consensus, remarkably, is absolute on the core issue. The fall of Eli's house is fundamentally anti-predation, not anti-priest. It is not an attack on the institution of priesthood itself, or even on hereditary leadership if it's righteous. It is a ruthless, divinely sanctioned attack on the abuse of that institution and the profound betrayal of the public trust that priesthood represents.
And Samuel's rise correspondingly.
Samuel's rise is consistently read as pro-conscience and pro-merit, not inherently anti-institution. His role isn't to destroy institutions, but to restore the moral clarity and integrity necessary for legitimate authority to function, whether that's prophetic, judicial, or eventually monarchic. The enduring pedagogy of this chapter across all these layers is profound and maybe uncomfortably relevant.
Which is
Leadership, especially sacred leadership, is fundamentally the custody of other people's offerings, their trust, their vulnerability. When leaders exploit that trust and feed on the worshipers they are meant to serve, prophecy, or at least profound critique, must target those leaders. Conversely, when servants listen, when they maintain integrity, in Shomia, then revelation can return and legitimacy can be restored. The lesson for you, the listener, seems crystal clear from this text. Office held without conscience does not last. Merit, integrity, and accountability must always sustain leadership over mere lineage or title. #outro.
Well, this deep dive has certainly taken us on an incredible journey, from the gritty realities of an Iron Age cultic center at Shiloh through the sharp theological agenda of the Deuteronomistic editors shaping the narrative during exile.
Across a millennium and more of commentary, grappling with the text, the nuanced legal defenses worked out by the Talmudic sages, the linguistic and philosophical rigor of medieval figures like Ibn Ezra and Rambam, the stark political warnings drawn by Abarbanel after the trauma of expulsion, and the profound moral theology of modern thinkers like Heschel.
We've seen that understanding the context of every figure, Eli, the symbol of hereditary failure, Hophni and Phinehas, the epitome of institutional abusers, Samuel, the model of the charismatic listener, and crucially, all the subsequent interpreters who wrestled with their legacy is absolutely critical to grasping the weight of this story.
And this narrative really forces us, even today, to consider the ethical hierarchy that must exist within any system of power. The idea that authenticity, moral merit, and genuine service must always outrank hereditary privilege, institutional title, or unchecked power. The focus remains relentlessly across centuries on demanding accountability for the abuse of public trust.
And the power of this particular story lies, perhaps most disturbingly, in that finality we discussed. The sin was deemed unatonable by the existing system because the very means of repair, the ritual system itself, had become the site and the tool of the corruption.
Which leaves us perhaps with a final provocative thought for you to consider. If the deep, systemic sin of Eli's house could not be atoned for by mere sacrifice, because the very ritual mechanism designed for atonement was itself broken and compromised, what contemporary ethical or systemic failures do we see today? Perhaps in our political systems, our economic structures, our religious institutions, failures that have gone so deep, become so ingrained that they seem to be beyond the power of our current institutions and rituals to truly repair.
That's a challenging question.
It is. What kind of systemic structural crisis in our own time might require a totally new, perhaps prophetic voice, an outsider voice like Samuel's, to break the silence, expose the rot, and demand fundamental accountability, signaling perhaps that the old system, however venerable, has finally run its course and cannot fix itself from within? That is the lasting and perhaps uncomfortable challenge this ancient narrative still poses to our modern systems of power and authority.